So hi, everyone. I have got Daniel Bennett with me today. Me and Dan go way back, further than I'd like to admit. I think we must have met at a behavioral economics event like 10 years ago or something crazy like that. So thanks so much, Dan, for being with us today.
Pleasure. Thanks for inviting me, Joe.
Great. So just as a little intro to Dan. So Dan is the consulting director of the behavioral science practice at Ogilvy, one of the world's leading marketing and advertising agencies, headquartered in New York, but a British company. And Dan has been working at the forefront of applying behavioral science to business for many years now. And so, Dan, I'm going to talk to you today about your work at Ogilvy, hearing a bit more about what it's like to apply behavioral science as a day-to-day job.
Sounds super. Can't wait.
And so me and Dan was telling me before we started that I actually am responsible for Dan's love and happiness in life, because a couple of years after we met, I invited Dan and another like a kind of junior behavioral science person called Sarah, and they both came up to Cambridge, and we had a nice day out in Cambridge, and we went punting on the river, which is where you get a big stick and you push it into the river and you push your boat along. And Dan, maybe you can finish off the rest of the story about punting.
So yeah, we were. It was my go to do the punting. I think the stick had got, if you call it a stick, has got stuck in the mud at the bottom. So I
It's
was
the
really
punt.
straining. It's the punt. Okay, yeah. So I stuck the punt in the in the sticky mud, and I was trying to turn us around, which made it look like I had a very large bicep, which was great. So Joe took a photo, I think just by chance, sent me the photo, popped it on my Tinder profile, and that won me my and they said my present girlfriend. That's not how you explain them, is it? My girlfriend, and so I have Joe to thank for my love and happiness. So when he said if you got half an hour for a podcast, I was thinking okay, I have everything for a podcast for you, Joe.
Thanks, Dan. I'm very pleased to hear that I had such a profound impact on your life. That's great. So, Dan, could you just start off by telling our audience about how you got into behavioral science, and also, as a second part, like what you like most about it? So, give us a little history, and also tell us like the nice, warm, fuzzy things about your job.
Yeah, I mean, the truth is that I initially wanted to do philosophy and ticked the wrong box at my A-level choices. Ended up doing psychology through a mild dyslexia and realised I absolutely loved it. So there was that. I do remember when it was about picking kind of university courses that, I mean, there's in all of us, there's so many deep reasons why one might be interested in why human beings do things or don't do things. I think there's all of that. But I also think that I haven't really met anybody that isn't interested in psychology. I think it's just one of those subjects where there's an endless fascination. I do think I really like how I think at the time I didn't understand this, but I like the marriage of the science and the creativity that it inherently has. I think people forget that behavioral science has creativity at its heart. Else, how do you generate the theories and the experiments along the way? So, as much as I love the empirical nature of it, because I like the idea of having um, a codification of human behavior. I also like the novelty and the creativity of all of the experiments, and I think that's kind of carried on into my job now, really.
Mm-hmm. And can you tell us a little bit more about your journey? So, I mean, as far as I remember, you in some ways, maybe people might see it as lucky that you finished your undergrad degree and you went straight into Ogilvy. Is that right? And then you've
Yeah.
managed to work your way up since then. But was that also kind of by chance, or was that something that you were like determined for? Because I think that you were working there like part time, maybe during the end of your degree.
It was, yeah. I mean, so I had that kind of end of the third year freak out where I realized I needed to plan my life. And so I just applied for as many things as I possibly could and did feel like I got quite lucky with, at the same time, um, the way I got into behavioral science as a discipline rather than just being interested in psychology was I saw like many people, the Dan Ariely TED Talk and the Rory Sutherland TED Talk, and got really excited by it. Managed to reach out to Rory on Twitter. He was talking about behavioral science quite a lot. Anyway, with his Institute of Practitioners of Advertising presidency, and he'd chosen behavioral science to be the top of that. At the same time, that was the same time I was studying at university and getting quite excited by the idea about actually applying this stuff rather than kind of just doing more theoretical things. And so Ogilvy decided to launch a practice. I was lucky enough to be hired as the first member, and then, as you say, kind of the past 8 or 9 years, depending on how long in the future people are going to watch this for 8 or 9 years, and kind of worked my way up to co-lead the team there.
Great. And can you tell us a little bit about how your role has changed during that time? Like, I imagine the tasks you were doing and also just your responsibilities have changed a lot over the last 8 to 9 years. Can you tell us about that journey a bit?
Yeah, we've grown a team with us over the kind of the 8 or 9 years. So we're up to about 15 people now, and then of course we work with hundreds of people across the Ogilvy network. The first kind of 1 to 3 years of behavioral science really was kind of the what we might call like tidying things up using behavioral science, kind of optimizing existing systems, existing communications, existing products and services, and saying, from a behavioral science point of view, we think this should be the sentence of the subject line, and excuse me, from a behavioral science point of view, we should be using this imagery on this piece of communication. I think what's really happened over kind of, that was years 1 to 3, years 4 to 6 opened up a lot more. It was really about, we were getting opportunities then around kind of generating from first principles, if you like. So large companies saying to us, we have a recycling problem with our packaging. How do we solve this globally? And we're really starting to build systems from the ground up. We would have large tech companies come to us and say, we're about to launch this product. How should we change the product? How should we change the communications around it so people trust it, so people want to use it habitually, and so on and so forth. So kind of what I would call kind of more meatier briefs, and really kind of putting behavioral science at the top of the chain rather than it being the thing that kind of like just tidied up before it left the office. And then what's happened in kind of years 7 to 9, which I think is quite interesting, is there's been a lot more focus about internal behavior change within organizations. So I think first organizations picked this up and said this would be fantastic for shaping customer behavior. And I think now they're realizing how much it shapes internal behaviors too. And that is quite a recent thing for us, which is really exciting. And the outputs become a lot more, whereas before in the earlier days it's a lot more tactical outputs. It's now managing to affect that upfront strategy. And I know that's a load of waffle about advertising speak, but there is that the importance of that is that the further we can get up that food chain, the more we can make meaningful, scalable difference. And that is the challenge that behavioral science has right now, I think, which is it's hyper discrete areas that it's affecting, and really to get sustainably embedded into an organization, we need to get further up that chain.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. I guess there's always this tension that the more discrete and tactical rather than strategic you are, the easier it is to prove you've had an effect, right? Like, so if you're saying, hey, you had this headline for your emails and we changed it to X and we saw 20% more people opened it and responded, that's like a clear, tangible win. Whereas internally, organizations are often concerned about culture and concerned about like your risk and like these things that are systemic and much more difficult to prove that you've changed. You know, I think the traditional behavioral science approach is to say that culture, everything is just made up of individual little discrete nodes that we can maybe like twist one at a time. But I don't think that like people managers or HR directors find that a super compelling kind of argument for how they should budget their money towards improving employee outcomes.
You're right. You make me realize that kind of we're desperate for concretization because it's really hard to say what behavioral science is, or at least I find it really hard to say what behavioral science is to someone who has money and needs to change people's behavior, because so we're so desperate to point to concretization. So there's no wonder that the field celebrates itself, I think, with really lovely, discrete examples like pension opt-ins and outs and flies in urinals and all that types of things, because you can point at it and you can go, that has an effect, that's a measurable effect. And I think that like you said, that can be limiting, because engineering as a field can point to bridges and can say, we did that, society, we did that, and look, God, everything's so much different because of that. I'm not sure that behavioral science yet has its bridge to point towards. There isn't a company, there's a lot, we can post rationalize a lot of business decision making to say they followed fantastic behavioral science implicitly, but there's not that many things that have been baked up from ground up. And I think that's what that will hopefully transform the field once we can point to our bridges. Some people say the pension opt-in opt-out is a fantastic is a they call them behavioral unicorns, don't they, which I quite like.
Behavioral unicorns, I love that. I think we've got some behavioral unicorns. Like, I don't know, to me, I think the pension opt-in opt-out is one, but also, I mean, in the UK just changed its rules around organ donations to be opt-in opt-out. And again, I feel like that, especially maybe for the organ donations one, because the behavioral science field has become more mature during the discussion around whether we should do that or not. I think that was very much an evidence-based decision. Whereas I think the pensions one, like, even then, you could kind of argue that there were like other forces at play there. Whereas I think that the organ donation one, it's literally just like pointing at a couple of behavioral science papers and being like, hey, like, look at all these other countries. Like, we know defaults work in this way. We should do them. But yeah, I agree. We could, let's have as many unicorns as we can. And maybe not everyone's going to find those quite esoteric examples convincing. But yeah. So Dan, could you also talk about, so you mentioned that over the course of your career so far in Ogilvy, you've been working at kind of different levels, both on the consumer side and the internal communication side. Do you have like a favorite project you've worked on, or is there one that you could kind of unpack in some detail because it's like stayed with you?
I definitely have a favorite project I worked
Great.
on, and I think it's because I'm mad about aeroplanes, which makes me sound a bit strange. But it was Gatwick Airport. So if you've been to Gatwick Airport, you would have been through Gatwick Airport security, and it's pretty good. Like, it's on industry averages, you get through pretty quickly, and it's incredibly safe, which is obviously a very good thing. Obviously, the whole airport security game is about balancing out security with kind of practicality of getting people through. Obviously, every minute extra in the security queue is a minute less in the shops on the other side, and airports make an incredible amount of their money from that. So the more efficient we can make that system, the more revenue it makes the airport.
Can I just push back on that? But that doesn't sound intuitive to me at all. It sounds much more intuitive to say, make the queues really annoying and long, because then people will have to budget longer time in the airport because they don't want to be stressed. And so then people would hang out on the other side for a couple of hours rather than 30 minutes or whatever.
That's a really interesting point, isn't it? Yeah, the more efficiently you make the system, the less uncertainty people have, and therefore they'll go, oh, it's city airport. Oh, it's basically a fly through. Yeah, that's a very interesting point. But if we pretended that wasn't true, then we would definitely a good hypothesis. We were looking at how we might reduce what they call the liquid reject rate. So basically, when you go through security and you have to take all your liquids outside of your bag and put them in a little plastic bag, and you put it through. Now, basically, a lot of people don't get that right. And the challenge with that is you then have to pay more security people to go through more items. The queues are shorter. You'll notice that, when the tray goes through and there's that kind of arm of death that like chooses whether your tray goes through or not, and you're panicked as hell when that's happening. And basically, there's only a certain amount of room on that back tray, and if it goes into what the industry called dieback, once dieback happens, that means all the trays are full. Then the arm of death can't push anymore that way, so it can't let any trays through. So basically, the whole system melts down very, very quickly. So the problems aren't linear; they exacerbate very quickly. So you want to make sure that people get through, and therefore you want to make sure that people are packing their bags correctly. Now, they tried all of the things you might think of. At Gatwick, they have all those tables outside. They even give the bags away for free at Gatwick. Like, they have seemingly clear signage. But there's so many different challenges that there are. And so we went in, and they wanted to use a behavioral science lens and a creative lens to basically understand, why is this problem happening and how do we change it? Because for 10 years they hadn't managed to solve it really. And the interesting so obviously we go and we start to work with their current hypotheses and also just count lots of data. So they didn't know which liquid it was, which is the highest offender. And it turns out it is water. But the guesses before we actually counted was that it was things like toothpaste and things that you wouldn't think
I
of
thought it'd
as
be makeup.
liquid.
Yeah, it always seems to be women at the end who, like have too much makeup. So.
There is a lot of makeup, yeah. And I mean, one guy was taking. I mean, also you see some bizarre things. We were there at like 4, 5 a.m. like counting behind the scenes, and people tried. One man tried to take a circular saw blade through. There were just some really strange things that we saw. But
Amazing.
I think he was a magician. That's the only thing we could think of. Anyway, a magician with only hand luggage. So we were counting all these different bits, and one of the hypotheses was that it was French and Italian people that were the worst offenders. And it was quite an interesting thing. So we looked into kind of destination where people were going from, and nationality, and all those types of things. And it turns out that even if we counted for weeks and weeks, collecting all this data, and we couldn't find any correlation between nationality, culture, or anything like that. Wasn't anything between short haul or long haul or the type of suitcase, all the things you might expect. And it turns out that we think that what we witnessed was, when French and Italian people get pulled over for having an offending item in their bag, they communicate a lot more visibly and loudly, and are a little bit more confrontational than, say, English people who are just very polite and very embarrassed that the whole thing's happened. And so it could be that actually that if you ask the airport security workers why is it happening, they remember more those interactions with French and Italian people, and therefore then think that's the problem. So what the airport did, they go and update all their signage before security and make sure it's in all of the languages of the offending people that they thought it was. But if you count the data, you realize it's not those people at all. So it's just a really interesting of how all these psychological biases can make you create the wrong solution. Anyway, we find out that there's not much you can find in the data really, apart from knowing it's certain. But we do just realize it's either that people don't know, don't remember, or don't care. So there's people that simply just don't know the rules through, they don't travel very often. So don't remember is, you kind of know you travel quite a bit and you just got so much on your mind, you just want to get through security. And don't care was, I know I've got too much in here, but I'm going to try it because at Heathrow sometimes it works, or other airports. And we kind of categorize that. Obviously, everybody says it's not don't care, so that's a wasted thing to capture on people. And so we basically realized that we need to create a moment of conscious reflection, like a system to switch on when you're going into that area. Um, and sadly, this idea never got implemented because the whole project was cancelled. So I don't know why it's my favorite project, but the whole project was cancelled once they lost some of their key airlines through some difficult times. But the idea still remains, which I think is interesting, which is having 2 archways when you go in. So rather than just having one on door, making people make an active choice to whether they're liquid security ready, we'd need to work on the language, or I need some to go and help pack. If you think you're ready, then we diagnose you as overconfident and we take you down the corridor of doubt, where we remind you with lots of these messages: are you sure, are you sure, are you sure? If you need education and you need help, then you go into a zone where there are all the tables that are out there, and you get messaging that's more targeted towards the problem that you have. So kind of this double archway, forcing you to go, am I ready, aren't I ready? And then treating you as either overconfident or you get the help that you need. I thought was a really interesting thing that without behavioral science and without collecting the data and doing all the great things that applied behavioral scientists do, and without the creative lens to come up with the double archway, I don't know if the airport would have got there itself. So that I think that's why it was so interesting to me, which is there are ideas if you put a behavioral lens and a creative lens together that would generate ideas that no one else can. And it kind of, I think a lot of people think behavioral science is very good for deduction about telling you it's out of all these things, it's this one. And I think it can be. But I think we forget that behavioral science is also very good at getting us to ask new questions about things we already know and opens up the solution space. And that's what I get quite excited about. So that's why Gatwick was one of my favorite because I think it opened up a solution space that we wouldn't have seen without the lenses.
Yeah, that sounds great. I love that. I love that's a great project. I like that you looked at the data and like you didn't see any clear pattern. And if you'd asked the people through an ethnography, you wouldn't have got the right answer either because people don't know the right answer. And so you had to kind of not just use behavioral science, but also use the other features of the Ogilvy business, like as in the creative team, to come up with this answer. I love that. Could you talk about, because that was your favorite project, could you talk a little bit about the disappointment that it didn't happen? Because as someone who works for companies sometimes, I will happily admit to the pain, the trauma that I have been through where, you know, you're working on some really exciting project, everything's going really well, you feel like you've got something really good, and then someone in the organization changes jobs or like, you know, budgets change or priorities change or whatever, and then boom, done. And especially if you're like independent like me, that could be like 4 months of work that's just kind of gone out the window, which is very frustrating. But for you guys too, I'm not sure from a budget perspective, but also just from your own internal motivation, it must be quite, I don't know, disheartening when it doesn't work out. Could you talk about that a bit? And does that happen quite a lot, or is that very rare?
I genuinely picked the example on purpose because I do think it's important to talk about this area of behavioral science where it doesn't happen, and because I think it's a lot when I've been speaking to people one on one, a lot of people admit to this kind of mixed results in terms of actually getting stuff into the world. Like, do behavioral scientists make more PowerPoint than impact? Like, and I think there's a base rate neglect thing going on there, where it's like I think that's what service consultancies do in general. Like, I think there is that conversion rate challenge from that. I think so yes it does happen, and but we also get lots of great things out in the world. I think part of it is a numbers game and part of it is expertise. I think on the expertise side of things, I think I think I certainly get more things out in the world now than I did when I started. So I do think there's and I think we have a lot more great people, complementary skill sets in the team now than before. So I think it's going to take more than behavioral scientists to get behavioral science out into the world. And I think that is something that's dawning on a lot of us slowly. So what the magic of working at Ogilvy um, is that we have fantastic operations people who are used to organizing, film shoots in South Africa, getting permits and all that kind of stuff. We have great account leads who kind of intimately know a client organization through and through across the world. We have um, great production people. We have great designers. We have sketch artists that can like bring to life the ideas. So rather than it being a sticky note, it can be a bit more tangible. But despite all of that, it's not that we have 100% success rate in the marketplace with getting every idea that we come up with made. And I think that yeah, so several factors. I think one is that I think we have to find a way of making behavioral science projects have shorter timelines, because I think part of like that natural changeover that you get in an organization, you do find that sometimes a project can go wrong because someone simply leaves and the next stakeholder hasn't read Thinking Fast and Slow like the last one had, which I think is quite key. So I think there's an element of trying to keep these timelines short. Board meetings happen every 3 months typically. So if you can't make an update every 12 weeks, then you're not going to get the air cover that you need, or the backing that you need. And I think we need to understand how to interface better with organizations. So even no matter whether you're like Ogilvy were interfacing a company to do a project, or whether you're a behavioral science team inside an organization, you're still selling your behavioral science wares and hosting projects. And I think, and you'll still have partners and executing it. So I think we have to get better at partner management. And so I think um, once people have graduated with master's degrees in behavioral science, then I think we then need to get everybody to graduate. If your intention is to go into applied behavioral science, you then need to kind of almost graduate in the school of life and learning how to partner management and all of those types of things, because a theory by itself isn't enough, I don't think, to get that impact in the world.
That's fascinating. I really like to hear your insight on that, Dan, about like that we need to get better at stakeholder management. And I think you know that for a little while I used to help big corporates find behavioral scientists to work with, and I was often quite confused by this request they would always have for like, yeah, we want someone who knows a bit about behavioral science, but really we want someone who like is a stakeholder manager. And I'm like, really? Like that's as high as it is on your agenda when you've got these people who I'm wheeling out to you with these brilliant, research backgrounds and degrees, and you want someone who's worked in a matrix organization, which I never understood what that was.
I still don't.
I still don't.
I think I'm in one.
But I think the way you're describing that there makes a lot of sense. That it's a whole different skill set. It's something that we should be trying to train people in, because when you're trying to introduce anything new into an organization, there are all these like risks attached to it, and you think you can get better at it over time. Just in terms of your own personal feelings about that, can we unpack that a little bit? So, I mean, when I said before that I've had these projects that have not happened, it really upsets me. It's kind of like, okay, you've just really wasted my time. Like I feel like rejected in some way. And it makes me maybe less keen for the next time. I think that actually over time, in a slightly sad way, I've become a bit less ambitious with these projects. I don't invest as much in them because I know that they might not work out. So I'm kind of like, until I get the data, I don't count chickens, and that means that I don't overinvest. Whereas I actually feel like some things are still really hard to do. Those like golden projects are still really hard. So you kind of need to go in there all guns blazing 100% for like your dream projects to happen. So could you just explain, like, maybe not for the Gatwick one, but for another one, like how you stay motivated afterwards, or maybe it doesn't really matter for you because you've always got multiple projects, so in some ways you're relieved that there's like your capacity can now go somewhere else.
At least that was ended. Yeah. No, I it's a really good question, and to answer it really honestly, I find it gutting. Like, I mean, it is a dark day when you get an email saying, sorry, this can't happen anymore, or sorry, this hasn't worked, or we're not able to implement, or sometimes just people go quiet. And I think yeah, it's gutting. And because the reason I get out of bed is to drive the movement of applied behavioral science. Like, so if we're not, and I think work is one solid compartment of that, which is if we generate the right case studies, then we can get the right, and we can inspire people with those case studies, and the movement continues. So I think it is absolutely gutting. I think we are lucky that like we've usually got about 25 projects on the go at one time. So if 5 are nearing that kind of, all 5 are going into test, or 5 are going into field, or 5 are going into the manufacturers, or whatever it is, like that's always good. And then there might be 5 at the other end that are kind of 5 are stalled, 5 are sticky. So when we look at a status sheet, yeah, maybe I've been saved a bit by kind of like always at least having something that's nearly working, which is good. So I think it is galling, it is gutting. I think having several on at that same time is useful. But I also think that we have to learn how to I don't know how to express it, but I think it's about ensuring that we learn from, almost like, like in the way that like air traffic investigators, so when a plane crashes, they send a bunch of people in, and they're just incredible at like kind of figuring out all of the different factors that led to the problem. I do think we have to be good like that. And I think I feel like I've developed a better nose for is knowing I sound like some kind of messiah. I'm really not, but I feel like when I'm having a new business conversation now, I have a better nose about whether there are certain indicators in the organization that I know whether this is going to be an interesting exercise or a non-goer, or no, this is actually going to happen in the field. So I got quite excited when we started working with a yogurt company that I can't tell you the name of, because I was like, okay, this is a medium-sized organization. We have good senior contacts, which are really helpful along the way. There's a certain culture to the organization that isn't overly demanding in terms of kind of process and backup, but also isn't overly creative. But I'll try everything and nothing will work, kind of thing. Um, and what are the other indicators? Usually, kind of some kind of meaningful budget, although that's not always the case. Um, and and them having a track record of also producing, getting ideas out into the world, and kind of not overly bureaucratic. And I feel like I have a sense of like, okay, these people have like a route to market from like strategy to idea to execution, and we're going to be good here if we can. And then I'm like, I hope we can deliver the goods. When I start to feel nervous, I'm like, okay, no, this is a good one. Yeah, I think it's about us trying to get better at. I don't think every organization and every person in an organization is suited to the type of work that behavioral science does. So I think we can be better at kind of picking out our friends, really.
Yeah, that sounds great. You should turn that into intellectual property, or at least that's a very valuable skill that you've developed, which is, like you said, the nose of figuring out, hopefully as soon as possible, what's going to happen. Because in some ways, maybe it's fine for, like you say, a certain number of projects not to work out. But if you can increase that hit rate by a small percentage, and that means that you get the completion fee rather than the exploratory fee for more, then that could be a big game changer. Kind of a related question to the how annoying is it when things don't work out is that in all of you're an agency, and so even if we just forget about the behavioral science like element of being in an agency for a second, like a lot of work comes about by tenders being like released and then proposals being put forward for those like longer term contracts. I'm just interested. I know that for PR in particular, but also in marketing in general, that's a lot of how the work works. I'm just interested. How does behavioral science fit into that? Might it be that there's a communications project that you would also bid for as if you were just like another marketing agency, or is it always something like bespoke, and so you don't tend to have this the tender and proposals for the tender setup?
Yeah, I have quite a strong point of view on this one, which is I feel like, and there's no data on this, but my experience is that the RFPs, as they call them, those kind of like when an organisation says we've got a load of money and we want to give it to, and we're going to host a Britain's Got Talent contest to find out who's going to get it. Those are few and far between. It's highly competitive, and or they're fewer and further between than they were when I started kind of 8 years ago. And
Really
so I
interesting.
think,
That's a trend. I didn't realize that that's how it works. And that's just because people want change quicker, and people felt like, because often the problem with those RFPs is that they tend to go on average to the people who had it before. And so
yeah.
there's like a default. And I'm just interested in why you think that trend has occurred, because I didn't know that was the case.
Yeah, I think that a lot of client-side organizations are realizing that in order to get more value out of their partners, project work is, do you get more value out of someone who's saying you're going to guarantee you're going to work together for 3 years no matter what happens, or are you going to get better value out of people from going, we've got 3 months together, let's see what happens, and then we might get. I just think the motivations. I mean, I find it a lot more exciting to work on those things because you have that kind of natural sense of the hunt a bit more. So I think there's an element of, and again, there's no data, so that might not be the case. But I feel like the people that I speak to, like the project work, is on the rise, and I think that it creates quite a lazy attitude if an organization just has to sit there and respond to party invites. Like, I don't think that's a very good mindset for growth. Whether actually, if you're a project-based business, then you're always thinking about who do we speak to? How do we, as David Ogilvy said, be interested so we're interesting? So rather than just going, here's our creds, how do we say, do you want to solve this massive behavioral challenge together that you might not even know you had? Like, so it's a bit more kind of like outbound. It's a bit more proactive. It's a bit more, yeah, being interested so we're interesting. And so I think that RFPs still have their place, and some behavioural science RFPs happen. I think the government have the behavioural science roster,
Yeah, which is
and you
like
can get yourself on that.
Ipsos and a handful of others who are on, and behavioral insights team who are on that, like 5 companies.
Yeah, exactly, and yeah, fantastic. If get yourself on that, definitely. But I'm not sure that that's the only one that I know of. Do you know what I mean? Like it's I don't think there is a behavioural. We're not at that state of kind of market maturation, if you like, where there's behavioural science um, setups like that. So I think that kind of the success of behavioural science at the moment is still in this kind of going to organizations with ideas that you can create value for them, that you can help grow them, and that'll in turn help grow you. I think that that's far more powerful than trying to. I feel like we're at a turning point where the old game was trying to get big RFPs, which is great for organizations because they get sustainable revenue and everybody loves certainty. But actually, I think the new game is a bit more like the design world, where it tends to be more project-based fees.
That's really interesting. And I really liked your last point about, going in to grow them, to grow you, or like, so I seem to recall, like, I would definitely say that now Ogilvy seem like the most established behavioral science team in London that I know. Like, you guys are the biggest, you have very good communications about who you are, and like that you've got different skill sets in the team. And I've come up to your offices and I love your rooftop, and things like that. So, but I kind of seem to remember that there might have been slight growing pains at points, or points where the team didn't seem to grow as quickly as you maybe had hoped it would do. And just in terms of like was there a formula for like, if you guys make X money, you get extra headcount? Or because you were maybe, there's this kind of critique of behavioral science that you can just like sprinkle a bit of behavioral science into things that were already done by an organization. Maybe that comes back to the kind of talking about versus doing, that dichotomy we talked about earlier. But could you maybe talk a little bit about how Ogilvy saw the growth of the team relative to like the revenue it would create?
Yeah, no, definitely. I think you should never want to become a behavioral science Tinkerbell, where you shake Tinkerbell and behavioral science comes out. Like that is the um, I don't know. I don't mean to offend anyone here if they were this, but like when I first joined Ogilvy, like agency that had a really good way of kind of to kind of show they had credibility in the space. They would hire kind of one person, and they would call them a head of mobile, for example, or head of something else, and it would be fantastic because when you're pitching for those RFPs, you wheel in the head of mobile, and they don't do this anymore, so that's why I'm saying it, but it would be I would hate to be a head of behavioral science who was just that person who was there to kind of like just distribute, the behavioral Tinkerbell. I just don't think that's going to help us develop the field in a way that I'm sure those people will play their role, but I don't think they're going to be the ones that open up the applied behavioral science for future generations, if you like. That sounds quite lofty, but I do think that's true. And I think I think my view is that kind of growing within a large organization is both really easy and really hard, because I think we have to remember that like um, it's different, it's new, like it's on the one hand behavioral science is very tactical work and it's simply about rather than doing emails this way, do emails this way. And on the other hand, at more of a higher altitude, at like a religious level, you have to change your religion because you have to stop believing in heterodox economics or all that kind of stuff, and you have to start believing in other things. And so I think that people get convinced at behavioral science at kind of different levels, and so I think, and then therefore you get let in more so at different levels. And so I think there's a moment where, when like you're really cold and you can put a coat on and it like warms your skin up, but your core's still pretty chilly. Do you know what I mean? Like, and you have to like have a long bath to warm your core up. I feel like with behavioral science, applied behavioral science, the world is kind of like we're warming the skin of people, but we haven't always penetrated to that deep core of getting to them to truly believe. So I think there's elements of that. I think behavioral science is, and go back to the Ogilvy question. The challenge with behavioral science is that it's everything and it's nothing. It's either an incredibly narrow field where we're at the pointy end of the pointy end of the pointy end, to be wheeled out in very hyper specific situations to solve problems, or it's the way we should be doing everything. So it's like it's a gas, not a solid. And I think, who was I speaking to the other day? She's the chief behavioral officer of Marriott, Charlotte Blank, isn't it? And she said one of her team explained behavioral science is a verb, not a noun. And I was like, that's exactly what it is. It's kind of, it can be a way of doing things rather than a thing. So I think organizations struggle to know, is it a thing or is it how we should be doing everything? And we do have some amazing leadership at Ogilvy that are really understanding that it's more the verb than the noun. So we're about to go through some quite interesting changes, I think.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I love this. I feel like I'm learning loads of good terms I'll definitely use again. Like behavioral unicorns, totally using that. Like the Tinkerbell, used in a purely derogatory way. Like love that. And then now also it's a verb, not a noun. These are all like ding, ding, ding. No, no, no.
I hope I got that the right way around.
Cool. So I don't want to keep you much longer, Dan, because this is actually Dan's day off. So I'm stealing his precious time to go and frolic outside in the rain during lockdown. But just as to kind of or to finish, get towards the end, I think Ogilvy's done a really good job of trying to like cultivate newer talent. They've had this like internship scheme for current students and things like that. And I don't know, from my perspective, it is hard to, there's lots of people who would like to work in behavioral science, and there's obviously fewer jobs than there are positions. And I think traditionally, there have been particular like degree programs or things that people sought people from. I think in my perspective, Ogilvy has been quite good at not just valuing those academic skills, but trying to value other things too. Like everyone I meet at Ogilvy is like very personable, often quite extroverted, and they seem to be certain traits that Ogilvy is looking for. I wonder if you would just mind commenting on when you're looking at very junior people for like either those internship roles or graduate roles, what are the kind of things you're looking for? And maybe beyond the kind of obvious, like has some knowledge in this, what are the kinds of human-like traits that you think would you find attractive in the most junior people?
Yeah, that's a very dangerous question to say. What do I find attractive in junior people? But the nothing. But the I'm sure you can't edit that out.
Yeah.
Ogilvy is really good actually at it's always like spoken to my deep values, that it is nicely open in terms of it for our creative internships. It doesn't ask for any degrees or anything. But I think the first time we ran what we call the pipe, we could have anybody of any age. So if he was 80 years old, you could have applied for the pipe kind of thing. And it was just like a real demonstration to say that when it comes to ideas, they really can come from anywhere. So that's kind of like Ogilvy level. At our team level, yeah, you're right. We run the Ogilvy behavioral science practice summer school every year. Not this year, sadly, because of the pandemic, but we should be back next year. We take hundreds of applications, and we have around 12 to 14 people that basically come to London for a residential for a week. We train them up in lots of different techniques, and they also work on a live client problem throughout the week. And at the end, they present their ideas. They work with Rory Sutherland along the way to work on their ideas. And then at the end, they present to to the client themselves, and often that work happens in the world, which is really, really good, because again, we use our noses to pick clients where it's going to happen. So that's really exciting. And from there, people tend to either get jobs with us or with other places as well, because it's a bit of a hallmark. Um, and what are the good traits in people? I think because where a behavioral science lens meets a creative lens. I think I have construction upstairs, but if you can still hear me,
we can.
um, and because we're looking for a behavioral science lens and a creative lens, that it's important that people have a good understanding of the behavioral science knowledge, have an appreciation of the models and the frameworks. And on the creative side of things, it's important that, and they have an appreciation for testing as well. And on the creative side of things, it's about making sure kind of we're open, where we build on each other's ideas. We truly value and have a vision for how behavioral science and creativity work together to open up more solution spaces. We call them unseen opportunities. That's our consulting language. So if people can kind of help us find those unseen opportunities within businesses, then they're the people that we would like to have in. And without the really unfortunate term is, you just kind of know when someone is kind of open enough to be creative and and knowledgeable enough to have the behavioral science side of things. So they're the two things that we look for.
That sounds great. Just one final bit of that. Like, so I think sometimes there's like I don't know, not attention. There's confusion about how technical someone should be to work in these kinds of roles. You know, I think a particularly problem with an organization as large as Ogilvy is that you've got a bunch of technical people. You've got econometricians in your quant advertising team. You've got these people. And so I wonder, like, is there some level of technical proficiency you desire, or do you see it more that there's different people with different skills in the team, and therefore you don't really look for some kind of cutoff in technical proficiency? I mean more like the stats side.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. I mean, okay, good question. So there's obviously the debate in the industry right now with different societies coming up that value different elements of behavioral science, and to make sure we kind of like rid the field of charlatans and we have a hallmark. And I think all good in my books that we do those things. For us, we look for T-shaped people. So it's kind of like people that are broad enough to understand the entire process, from the research to the ideation to the solution to the making and everything. But we don't expect everybody to be a deep expert, all of those things. So it tends to be that you want to make sure that people can do a whole range of them, but you want to make sure that you kind of like, you have a leaning towards the creative side, or you have a leaning towards the research side, or a leaning towards the experimental design side. And within that might fall statistics. For your question. So like, but it's not that everybody has to do everything, but you ought to make sure that you can be able to talk at a good level to each of those things. So we don't tend to have people that are like, I don't know numbers, but we don't need everybody to be like, to be that person who does that deep work, if that makes sense.
That definitely makes sense. Yeah, I think that's like reassuring to people who maybe like love this world, but maybe aren't a stats whiz. And I think that will obviously change by different organizations. Like I've worked closely with the FCA, for example, and their behavioral science team is basically like a data science team with some Tinkerbell nudging on it as well. So it depends on different areas. So Dan, thank you so much for giving your time. I know that listeners and my students will really appreciate hearing from you. I think you've been very frank and clear about the ups and downs of your job for the last 8 or 9 years. And yeah, just thank you again.
Oh, it's been such a pleasure. Thanks, Joe. Always loved doing this. And yeah, it's a nice chance to actually get to think back through all of that as well, because it's easy to get trapped in the day-to-day. So thank you.